The cases that stick in your mind are these breakthrough cases, these cases which you handle when you're a very young officer and which make your reputation. And I thought your Rossi story was in that ilk, and it meant an awful lot to you, not just because it's an interesting tale, but because it was your first step into the big leagues, where somebody somewhere would say, "Oh, you see that young fella, Simon McLean, solved these cases." And then they start to look at you, and then they think, well, maybe give him a wee break here, maybe do this or do that. So and I think it's very, very interesting that. And for a lot of policemen, myself included, some of the things you remember most vividly, for good and bad, by the way, for good and bad, are cases which happened to you right at the very start of your career. Tell the story again, as long as it does not involve Paul McCartney, okay?
Oh, drat. It'll be a quick story now then. I think you're right, Tom. At the time, there was a stubbornness about it. And I must admit, I enjoyed it because we're detectives. So I was a very young detective, posted at a place on my own. There was no other CID officers. I was unsupervised, if you like. And I always remember, what I remember is when I had the idea that it might be somebody other than who everybody else knew it was. And when I voiced it to the DI and the DS who were sitting in the pub at the time, they dismissed me completely offhand. You know that? One of them said something, and I think the sentence finished with, "and a bag of crisps and a packet of peanuts." You know, it was, I was sent to the bar for more drink, and whatever I said went right over their heads. They just kind of had a quizzical, like somebody comes out with something so far left field that it's not worth commenting on. It's not, it's just, and it's only the boy that's coming out with it. He'll learn in due course. And what it did was put a bee in my bonnet. That's what it really did. And there's no question what you said at the start there was true, though, because afterwards it was a different ballgame. When I went to the Serious Crime Squad, it was the instigation of my divisional commander, Willie Anderson, who you probably knew, Willie, very famous Glasgow detective and a real gent, who took me to the Scottish Crime Squad as well. But it was Willie that phoned me up, DC, and sounded me out about going to the Serious Crime Squad. And I was 26 years of age, Tom. In retrospect, I was too young. But he had seen something and wanted me to go and mix with the big boys up in the city. And we'd had arrested Paul Ferris in Rossi by that time as well. And I had met some of the squad. So you're absolutely right. My career took a shift because of that case. I'm quite sure of it, because I had gone off-piste entirely.
Simon, can you, just for the sake of listeners to this, some of them may be familiar with the storyline, but just very briefly paint us a picture of the case that you took over and the assumptions that had been made.
I was posted to Rossi, and the DI, Roddy MacDonald, who's now passed away, Roddy gave me an introduction to the office, introduced me to Chief Inspector, to the Fiscal, who he took me over to meet, Caroline McNaughton. The Sheriff in Rossi at that time was Irvin Smith, another very famous name in the west of Scotland. He showed me around the office, introduced me to the cleaners, to the staff, the typist, all the rest of it. And then as we were looking, and I had my own office, CID office, I had my own wee dark room as well next door, an IB room, which was some facilities thinking back on it. And I spotted an egg box, about 2 foot long, a rectangular egg box under the desk in the corner. And I said to him, "What's in the egg box, boss?" And he said, "Oh, you don't want to know." But he brought it out, and there was dust marks on the floor underneath it, Tom. And when he blew the dust off it and opened it up, it was just crime reports that were in it, historic crime reports. And it had been dormant for about 18 months. Nothing had happened along those lines for about 18 months. But what it contained was over 130 odd crime reports that were all indecencies. They were either flashing incidents or indecent exposures or assaults or attempt assaults, scaring girls, breaches of the peace. Pretty similar MO, all of them in varying degrees. Young girls mainly. I would say the oldest was probably in her mid-20s, but mostly teenagers. Similar times of night, just at dark, just at that twilight hour. and usually round about the woods that surround Rossi, and between Port Bannatyne and Rossi, it's a wooded area. Yeah? And this was all cases that had been unsolved. So you can imagine how many there had been if that was the CRs. You could probably pretty much double that, Tom, with the ones that were never reported to us. And these were unsolved at the time, up until 18 months before. The police had done everything. We'd had detectives over from the mainland, from Dunoon. We'd had policewomen over trying to set up some traps for this guy. The problem was that everybody knew who it was and just couldn't pin it on him. And the guy that they knew it was, Contini, was a local gangster. I suppose every town's got one. You know, you've got to have somebody. Every village, every town's got to have its gang leader. And Contini was that, and Rossi, he was feared with good cause. There's lots of stories I could tell about the violence that he'd been involved in over the years. He was a thief, he was a drug dealer, he was into everything that would turn a coin. He did spend quite a bit of time in the mainland, as you can imagine. And Rossi was a big shot, and he was quite ruthless. You know, he was a very violent character, and very, very well known to me over the course of my time, Rossi. So I was told this is who it is, but we can't prove it. We've got a few descriptions, but nobody can identify him. I think they had run a couple of parades over the years and never got him identified. But everything that you could imagine. But the boss put the lid back on it and stuck it under this table again, and that's where it was to remain. The only thing to emphasise there, Tom, is that it wasn't just the police that thought it was Contini. And they didn't think. There wasn't a question of we think. It was a fact. That's how it was told to me. And everybody, shopkeepers, you know, the lots of people in a rural community who are friends of the police, you know, or the firemen, the ambulance, the hospital staff, nurses, shopkeepers, publicans, business people, because as you and I know, 98% of the population just go about their business and never cause anybody any problem whatsoever. The people that you and I know are friends of the police, and they would help us in any way that they could. Thankfully, they're the witnesses at the end of the day. But everybody knew it was Contini. And then it happened again on my watch, probably about 10 months after I was sent over there as a detective constable. The detective constable in Rossi, unsupervised. I got a phone call late at night from a sergeant, Willie Young, and he said, Simon, I think you need to come down to the office. And Willie was an old sergeant. I think Willie probably had his 30 in at that point. So he had been round the block 2 or 3 times. And I knew if Willie wanted to speak to me then, I thought probably a cop had done something or, you know, something sensitive like that. But it turned out that these 2 wee girls had been attacked. One of them had run away in a wooded area in a lane leading through the woods. They'd been heading home, probably about 12, 13 years of age, perfect fit for Contini, and he grabbed one of them. The other one ran, turned and looked at him and screamed and ran. And he grabbed the other one round the neck from behind and touched her private parts. And she managed to struggle. And because of the screaming, probably, he let her go and she got away. And these 2 wee girls had reported it, obviously got home, and it had been reported to the police. So everybody knew who had done it, and it was a case of getting them in for questioning and trying to get some forensic evidence, all the usual stuff at the scene, at the locus, the wee girl, the doctors, all of that stuff that we had to do to pin it on Contini at last. You with me so far? Are you familiar with this story? I thought you'd maybe dozed off there. I thought
No. I didn't want to interrupt your stream of consciousness. I know how difficult that is for somebody your age. So I'm just letting you speak.
Yeah, you're right. Young guys like me find it hard to concentrate for very long. So your thoughts so far?
It's interesting because it reminded me actually of we had a series of house breakings in my division when I was a young cop. And we had a very famous housebreaker who he was called the Spade Man because he broke into garden sheds and stole garden tools to break into the house. And he was called the Spade Man, and he was a well-known criminal, hardened criminal, impossible to interview, and these crimes are just written off. And I can hear them say, "Oh, no, that'll be so and so and so and so." I'm not mentioning his name because he could still be alive.
Yeah.
that'll be so-and-so. There's no point in taking any further. And it was just this assumption. But it was also, it was an excuse as well, because it allowed these just to be parked. There was no point in further inquiry because it was impossible, because it was certainly him, but we'd never catch him. And that was this mindset. And it strikes me as something similar going on here.
Okay. And was that him? Did you ever?
It was sometimes, but not always. And of course, the eye sees and ear hears what's ever in the mind. So if people attended at the locus of the housebreaking, expect it to be this particular crime type, this particular modus operandi, they will actually adjust it so that it fits in.
Yeah.
So in actual fact, when we looked at some of the crimes, they weren't him at all. But the other thing about that was that eventually he was caught because the police were not the only people who believed his legend. He believed it as well.
Yeah, yeah.
He became complacent.
Yeah.
And he became older and he became sloppier. I know you identify with all these things. And eventually he got caught.
Yeah, I worked with some guys like that as well. Tom, I've got no doubt either that Contini, who I got to know very, very, very well, and there's a really funny story in my book about the Berlin riots when I came across him again in there, but I'm not going to spoil that, tell it here. But I got to know him very well, and I've got no doubt that some of those 134 crime reports in that box were down to him, because he enjoyed the notoriety of this. If you can imagine that he was totally safe, because he knew we couldn't find his footprints. We knew we would never get fibres from any of his clothes. He knew that we could never put him at the locus, because he was the only guy that knew he was never there. Everybody else was putting him there, but he knew the truth. But he loved the notoriety of it. Anybody else would have been coming to the police station and saying, wait a minute, why am I getting interviewed for this all the time? Why am I getting this name about? Because nobody wants to be known as a perv or a flasher or an indecent assault. Didn't bother him in the slightest. And if anybody had called him any bad names, he would have battered them anyway. Sorry, Tom, what were you going to say?
No, I was going to say, so why did you not fall for the same hypothesis? What was it that made you challenge the orthodoxy?
There was a couple of things that I wasn't comfortable with. That was all. It just started off me questioning it. I've done that so many times throughout my career. And I had a boss, Joe Jackson, who you also know very well, who sometimes let me go off on my own to pursue the feeling that I had. I don't like using gut instinct, because it's more than that. It's in your subconscious somewhere. But I just wasn't happy, Tom. I wasn't happy with it. And I got the feeling, like you've just said about your guy, that it was being dismissed and there was assumptions there that shouldn't have been made. The DI came over, the DS came over. I think there was a few DOs came over from Dumbarton or wherever, and they went through the motions. The locus was done. I think we got an IB guy over to take pictures and search the locus and all the rest of it. But it was all through the motions, the underlying assumption being that it was Contini. So it was half-hearted. It wasn't done properly. And in my mind, there was questions to be answered. And I think in the pub, the question I said when I said I was dismissed was that Contini was right-handed. He was an artist. He used to make money in Berlin or get paid in tobacco or whatever they get paid in, whatever the currency is in Berlin. I don't want to go into that. But he would make money from doing, remember the old cigarette boxes that they used to use to keep the baccy in, the baccy box? He used to decorate them with what we would call graffiti, but it was very popular in there. So he was an artist, and everybody knew he was right-handed. But the guy that touched that wee girl held her with his right hand and touched her with his left hand. And that was the first thing that hit me, was that's unnatural. In football, we'd call that an unnatural body shape. And the second thing was he had cut the wee girl, he had scratched her. The girl said he had jaggy nails. That was her expression. And the doctor said that it was consistent with him having a ragged nail that had caught her inside her private parts and had caused a laceration. And I knew Contini, and I knew that if anything, his nails were manicured. They would never be seen with a ragged nail. You know, he was always immaculate. So it was wee things like that. And then the clincher for me, when everybody went away home, as you know, these things, they last 2 or 3 days. Everybody stays in the hotel and has a nice time catching up with detectives from all over the division. They go through the motions, and that's not a slight to them. They had got into this assumption, they had got into this mindset because he was, and I don't use this word lightly, he was a bastard. And he was guilty of lots of crime in the area. He was the godfather, if you like, and he had no regard whatsoever for the police. I wasn't even allowed to interview him. The DI and the DS interviewed him. But if you're interviewing someone with an assumption that he's going to tell you nothing and that you're not going to get anywhere, you've lost before you start. So all of that was annoying me as a very young detective. And nobody was listening to anything that I said. So when they went away, I went and got the wee girl, went and saw her parents. I remember I'd probably not, I don't think I'd interviewed her. I think a policewoman interviewed her along with a DS. You know my place in this inquiry, well, all the gaffers are there. And once they go away, I can see that there's things not been done. And that there's anomalies here. I think somebody said to me that the wee girl maybe was related to Contini in some way. It turned out that she was kind of third cousin or whatever. In rural areas, you get that a lot of connections. You need to be careful what you say and who you say it to, because it can spread like wildfire. So when they all went away, I went and spoke to the wee girl again, this time with a fresher view of it, because I don't know necessarily. I'm trying to prove that it might be Contini. I've got a different outlook. And what I decided to do was to take her out for a wee drive with a policewoman. Her mum thought that was a great idea. It's good for a witness anyway to get that rapport with the police too. And I knew there was more to get here. Took her out for a wee drive, and I knew where Contini would be at that particular time of day, outside the bookies, between the pub and the bookies, on Montague Street and Rossi. And at some point during that wee drive, I took her down along the Montague Street. After we passed him, she said, "Mr. McLean, are you hoping for me to see Contini and tell you it might be him?" And I said, "Well, I know that he was standing. Do you know him?" And she said, "Oh, yeah, parties, christenings." You imagine she probably met him a dozen times or more and saw him most days of her life, going to school, coming from school, whatever. She said, "Oh, yeah." She said, "Mr. McLean, it's definitely not him." And so that was good. But she added a rider to that talk, and that's what changed the whole thing. She said, "It's definitely not him. But Mr. McLean, very, very like him." and that was 100% to me. She knew him, and she knew it wasn't him, but she knew it was somebody very like him. So the whole thing turned on its head for me then. And all of a sudden, I thought I had a glimpse of what might have happened here. And I had to go and look at his family and see if I could find someone in amongst his family who they had lots and lots of relations on the island, business people, all sorts of things, and lots of relations abroad and lots of relations on the mainland. So it became a thing that you're very accustomed to with the research that you do for your book as well, is piecing together the family tree and the connections and whatnot, which wasn't a simple task in 1984. Not as simple as it would have been now, because I had to get started and do that through the library and through the registry office and all these places that we get. And the press were brilliant as well, with old case files and stuff like that. But a laborious process. But it just shows you that we've done a podcast about the danger of assumption, and this kind of brings that home, doesn't it?
Yeah. It's interesting what you say, because clearly it shows you the value about re-interviewing witnesses, particularly victims. Because that wee lassie, on the night that she was attacked, she would be stressed, she would be injured, she would be, in a state of shock. If you think about it, it's the very last time you should be taking an important statement from him. And yet, at that time, that's what we did. And very seldom did we circle back. And I think I've told you about one of my early DCIs was a man called Bert Darling, who was a very, very good detective. His view was that the answer always lay in that first 50 witnesses. And he insisted that they were all re-interviewed, not once, but several times, and by different officers. That was his mantra. And, if that had happened, who knows? It might have been solved earlier, and you might have prevented a whole lot of people being victimised. It's interesting, too, that clearly there was no escalation to this man's offending. In many occasions, there is escalation. That's where somebody's life could have been forfeited. It could have been a rape and then turned into murder.
Well, I'm agreeing with you there, Tom, but it's not strictly true because he wasn't just that. Remember, he hadn't done anything for 18 months, and it transpired that he was in the forces. He was in Her Majesty's forces, and he was based, at that time, he was based in Germany. But he was a driver. When the thing took its natural course after we had dealt with him in Rossi Sheriff Court, he was shackled off to the continent. And I never found out the details of it, but I know that he had committed more serious crime on the continent, across the continent. So there was something about his hometown that maybe kept a lid on it for some reason. It kept him a bit suppressed because we reckon that there was a few attempt rapes in there, but he was never fully committed to it. He was scared because he ran off quite often. He ran off at the slightest sign of trouble. And that's another phenomenon. I had one under the Kingston Bridge where a pregnant girl was attacked by a guy at knife point, and he dragged her into a garden. And this happened in front of thousands of cars that were going under the Kingston Bridge at the time, just where Harry Ramsden's used to be. You know where I am?
Yeah, I do.
Under the bridge, thousands of cars, 5 o'clock at night, and not one car stopped when this girl was screaming and getting dragged into a garden. And there's no question he was going to at least rape her. And a wee boy of 12 drove past on his bike and saw this and stopped and got off his bike and walked into the garden. And I won't repeat what he said, but he basically said, "What do you think you're doing?" And the guy ran away. So basically they're cowards as well. So there's that anomaly in there. But he never escalated in his hometown, because it transpired it was his hometown, albeit he had left as a very young man. Just to put that to bed, he had been adopted. He had been born out of wedlock 35 years ago or whatever it was, 35 years before the crimes were committed, and had been shipped off the island at a very early age as a baby, basically, and had slipped through the net for that reason. A different name entirely. He had no pre-cons, no previous convictions whatsoever. And again, that's quite unusual because you would expect him to have been involved in some petty crime, maybe stealing off lines or prowling or whatever he might have been doing beforehand. So there's quite a few anomalies in there. But the purpose of me telling the story was to exemplify that not to accept. And it's not just detectives, Tom. You should never take things at face value. It's the same with getting phone calls, scam phone calls. 50-odd% of crime now is online. Don't take things at face value. That's really the lesson from that, isn't it? And make assumptions.
I remember an old DS I worked with. He used to shout ABC, accept nothing, believe nothing, check everything. ABC.
That's good.
That's still quite good basic advice, isn't it? And yet it's amazing how often they fall for it, and quite senior detectives too fall for it. And I mean, that's why it's interesting. I mean, I've done some work with Police Scotland's major crime unit who look at cold cases, old cases. The first thing they do is they're always challenging the hypothesis. And at every time they have a conference meeting, either the DI or the chief inspector says, yes, but what else could it be? Okay, we've got this line of thinking, what else could it be? And of course, it's a pain in the neck. Oh, God.
Yeah.
You've got to keep doing that. Otherwise, you find yourself in a hall of mirrors and and we can only be thankful. I mean, that man clearly had years of operating. I mean, it's a terrible thing for the victims, these girls who were assaulted, but at least nobody lost their lives.
I wasn't long in the crime squad. Joe Jackson was the boss of the squad at that time. And here's me, probably 4 or 5 years younger than anyone else in the crime. And I'd never worked in Glasgow. I'd never worked in the city. I had been a county man, Campbelltown and then Rossi. So this was a real anomaly that Willie Anderson had thrown me into for some reason. Because 10 months after that case, I was in the serious crime squad. I'd committed some misdemeanour. I can't remember exactly what it was. I probably blanked it out. And I got any trouble, and Joe Jackson got me in his office and he said, "You're fined 6 weeks overtime. You're going to work in the Crime Intelligence Unit," which was just down the corridor. But this was Strathclyde's Crime Intelligence Unit, Tom. You probably know it. You've probably been in it a few times.
Yeah.
And This was seasoned campaigners that were in charge of the crime intelligence unit. And although it was a punishment, what Joe was really doing, and he told me this later, he realised that I didn't have that foundation that most of the DOs in the city had, knowing about major index criminals on their patch. And I didn't have that coming from the county. So 6 weeks in crime intelligence with the DI and the DS in there would knock some sense into it. And it was, oh man, it was invaluable when it came to future undercover work with the football intelligence, with all that stuff. It was invaluable to me. But that was the same mantra in there. Nothing got into a file. Nothing got into a file card. It wasn't computerized, obviously, unless it was checked and double checked and triple checked. Talk about corroboration. No intelligence went in as intelligence unless it had lots of sources and you'd maybe gone out in the field to prove it or not prove it. Even checking addresses, checking flat numbers, regi numbers, everything was checked to the nth degree, because that intelligence, people's lives were depending on it sometimes when shit hit the fan.
The other thing about these intelligence files, of course, is if an error creeps in, then it poisons the whole system. And so it has to be absolutely right. And that's the reason for it, because the whole system becomes corrupted. Even if it's the misspelling of a middle name or the wrong date of birth or something transposed, the effects of that down the line are incredible.
Yeah, profound. That misspelling one, yeah, all of it, the detail. And that was a big, big lesson for me coming out of the CID and Rossi into the Serious Crime Squad. So it was a valuable thing that Joe did for me. It was certainly cost me a lot of money as well. I think the Bluebell Woods murder had just blown up over at Drumchapel, and I was excluded.
I was going to say, it sounds like one of these punishments that had a double-edged sword, truly a double-edged sword. So tell me, I mean, once you'd identified this guy, the suspect, I mean, in the army, what did you do? Wait till they came back, or did you get the military police to intervene, or how did it go? I mean, how did you prove it was him? Did he admit it?
No. Good question. Now I know why you got a deputy chief constable.
It's one of the reasons.
The only thing you didn't do there was caution me. As I did this research, oh man, it was painstaking. And remember, I was the only one in the world that thought I was doing anything constructive at all. I wasn't quite doing it in my own time, but Ian Gillis, the chief inspector at Rossi, sub-divisional officer actually, he'd made it perfectly clear to me that there was no overtime in this. He had no problem with me doing it, but just don't claim any overtime for it. That was the mantra with lots of things, as you know. So that IB room that I had at Rossi, I'd converted it into an office just for this purpose, and I built an anacapa on the wall. It was the only way I could keep track. I couldn't keep track in my head or even on bits of paper of the family tree and the extensions and relationships and cousins and brothers. You know how it goes. And they're all over the country, they're all over Europe. So I'd done an anacapa on the wall. And I must admit, at some points, I thought I was going daft. I know that my family thought I was mad. It was really, it became a labour of love. There was something swimming under the surface, a shadow that I just couldn't. And during the course of all that, I had spoke to Contini as well. He was coming out of the office, and I went up to him and put my hand out for him to shake it. And he did, because I took him completely by surprise. And I put my hand out. And as he took my hand, I pulled him towards me. And he thought everything was going to kick off there and then, because him and I were always bubbling. You know, there's a tension there that you know, and lots of police officers listening to that are very well aware of. It wouldn't take much to tip it over the edge on either side. I was right up close to him. I looked him right in the eyes and I said to him something like, "You're not a flasher. You're nothing. You'd never done any of these things, have you?" And he just smirked. He just smirked in my face, as I knew he would. And I don't know if I'm being melodramatic or not, Tom, but I was looking, and the purpose of it was to look in his eyes. And I knew it wasn't him. You know what I mean? He was taking the piss. That's what he was doing. So he was taking the mickey out of the police, Tom. That's what he was doing. So when I started piecing all this together, I got the DI over. And so when I tracked him down and discovered that this guy was in the forces, I had to get in touch with the forces. Tricky at my rank as well. It was very difficult. So I had to embroil the DI in that. who embroiled Pitt Street in it as well, and the fiscal. And really a lot of went on thereafter between the forces and Germany, etc., was done at that level because it becomes a political thing at that point. Kept out the media, all the rest of it, very sensitive. And at my end, I got a team. I then got a couple of DOs on the team to help me build this picture because we discovered right away, pretty much, I got a response pretty much right away that he could have been the guy because of leave dates and sickness and stuff that he hadn't been on service. And it coincided with enough of the dates that I was looking at that point to put him right in the frame. So it was arranged that an ID parade would be held for him. At that point, there was other people wanting him as well because his name had now come to the surface. I suppose we had a problem with this with the walking football, that a guy became known to be not in the straight and narrow as far as kids were concerned, and porn was concerned. And after the event, a lot of people said, "Oh, I knew there was something about him." You know that way?
Mm-hmm.
And that's a wee bit like this, that all of a sudden the pieces start to fall into place in other places too. But you asked if he admitted it when he came over, and I never got to arrest him. He was brought over by superiors, by forces, and he had the lowest self-esteem you could ever imagine. I don't think he ever looked at me. I did interview him, but he never looked at me, and he never answered anything at all. He was just so insignificant, such a wimp, is for want of a better word. How he was in the forces, but he was a driver, remember, probably driving long hours, heavy goods, whatever, just doing his job. And as long as you function in that environment, I don't think anybody's going to question anything else, as long as you're doing your bit efficiently. So we never get anything. What we did with the inquiry team, the purpose of that was to look into all these CRs and see what we could track historically from it and see what witnesses we could gather from that. We didn't have any forensic evidence, Tom. Nothing that we could use at that point. And I told you the story that he was adopted and away from the island and whatnot.
Yeah.
So he was probably second cousin to Contini that had been estranged from the family at a very early age. Yeah. And of the 134, I don't remember the exact figures now, but I think we ended up with 12 at the ID parade, including the two wee girls from the latter one, which wasn't a bad result. You know, it's less than 10%. Some of them we never ever traced. A lot of them hung up the phone. You know, they didn't want anything to do with it after 4 or 5 years. Yeah. Their lives had moved on. So we got about a dozen. I think we had more than that said they would come. But on the day, Sunday afternoon, we had to work it around ferries and things like that too. Distances too, people have moved away. So we ended up with a dozen, and I really don't remember how many identified them now, but it was significant. It was 7 or 8 of them, and that was enough for our purposes at Rossi. But he was convicted at Rossi and then weeked away to go. He was wanted for interview by lots of other places as well. I don't know what kind of roll-up that ensued after that.
He would be taken back into military custody. And by that time, I suppose they would be in contact with the local police in Germany and where else he was billeted. Similar if we spoke about the World's End murders, we had a lot of involvement with the military, special investigation branch of the military during that, because, of course, at one time, we suspected that a soldier might have been involved.
Yeah.
Because of the proximity of Edinburgh Castle. Yeah. And the large army garrison. Turned out it wasn't anything to do with the army, but we had a lot to do with the military. And of course, they were in Germany and Cyprus and all over the place. And squaddies who had been based at the castle in October 1977, they were in Cyprus 2 months later.
So that's where he ended up. And I've no doubt that he went through the system over there. And maybe nowadays it would be help that he would get, but he got to jail back then.
I wonder where he is now. Did he ever come back to the island? Did he ever?
No, he didn't. The reason I know that is because I've still got friends and contacts in the Isle of Bute. In these communities, there's no such thing as anonymity, you know.
Oh, no.
Which is a strength of these communities. It's something that I relied on to a great degree as a detective in Campbelltown and Rossi. It's that 98% that I'm talking about all talk to each other and they all know who's who. And back then, we had the GPO, we had the postman, we had the 192. I could phone direct to inquiries and find out where somebody lived. You know, there was a real local knowledge and a real community spirit going about. It's maybe changed a wee bit now.
Yeah, I've no doubt. Well, Simon, I've enjoyed your story very much. I have to say that you've gone up my estimation considerably, because up to now frankly, I thought you were one of these undercover guys that just sat about dressed as a tramp. I just, one of these people that actually never solved a crime. But that was
Well, that was the one. That was the one.
Listen, I'll tell you what. That's one more than many others have solved, Simon. And if it was the one crime you solved, then it was a very worthwhile crime you solved. Because I still think, regardless of the passage of time, that one of these fumbling sexual assaults could have gone wrong.
That was him starting up again after 18 months of wherever he had been. He was back on the island, and that was his first. He just made that one mistake, Tom, of coming to the place where I was the detective.
Some of these replies to the charge, you're too good for me. I thought you were day off today, and I would never committed that.
If I'd known you were here, I would never have done it.
If I'd known you were here, I would have stuck to the straight and narrow.
Tom, Irvin Smith told me a story once. Irvin Smith was the sheriff in Butte for many years, as you know. He used to cover Greenock because Rossi Sheriff Court only sat one day a week at that time on the Thursday. I don't think he even does that now, but the Sheriff Court only had the Thursday. And the other times he was over, the Monday to Friday, he was over in the Greenock Sheriff Court. He told a story one day that the weather forecast was horrific. And everybody knows that the Calmac ferry is probably going to be grounded. So he leaves the island early, and he's on the first ferry at 6:30 off the island, and gets off and gets away before the storm kicks in, because the ferries are cancelled thereafter. He's walking in. This is him telling the story, remember. He's walking into Greenock Sheriff Court, and if you've ever been there, there's big boards, Court 1, Court 2, etc., and it's got the name of the sitting sheriff at the top of the board, and then all the cases that are coming thereafter. And as he walks in, he's walking behind a bunch of suspects who are up at court that day, and they're looking at the board, and he hears one of them saying, "Oh, God, Irvin Smith, he can walk on water as well." And that's Irvin telling me that story. He loved it. He loved that kind of thing.
He was a great speaker, Irvin Smith. I remember him well. Yeah, he was good. I never worked with him, but I was at functions where he spoke, and he was a real character.
There was at that time. I hope they still have them, because he made the whole thing more palatable,
I've often said to people, if you want to see drama and entertainment and comedy all for free during the Edinburgh Festival, go up to the Sheriff's Summary Court.
I think on that note, Tom, it sums it up quite nicely that the truth is definitely stranger than fiction when you sit in the court for a day, isn't it?
There's no question about it. No question about it. Let's not worry ourselves with all this fictional stuff, Simon. We've got a lot of bizarre true stories, and that one you told tonight was very interesting. And that was your breakthrough.
That's it.
Good.
I'm still waiting for the next stage. Tom, have a great weekend, and I'll speak to you soon.
You too.
Good night.
Bye-bye now.
Tom, 25th of August. Not far away now. You're coming through to Glasgow. What's going on? How can I get involved?
That's right, Simon. Sunday, the 25th of August at 2 o'clock, Hillhead Library. It's a live Crime Time Inc. podcast. How to get there? Our website, crimetimeinc.com, and you'll get tickets, and it's free.
Fantastic. And it's going fast, Tom. I can assure you of that. Can't wait. See you there.